Okay, wonderful. So let me get started. I know we don't have a whole lot of time here, and this is a topic that is it's a pretty big topic, and there's a lot of parts to it. So I'm going to. There's a lot of details here in this topic, but since we don't have that much time, I'm really going to sort of touch on sort of the main points. Uh, and I have to sort of disclose it. This is probably one of the more challenging talks that I've done. Only because it's not something that you sort of get trained on. In school. You can't really go to a library to do the research and sort of look it up. A lot of this information is actually based on my experience working with children, adolescents, and adults with autism in the capacity of a psychiatrist, researcher, and probably the last 7 years or so as somebody who is very much interested in community development. And that's taking the form of Project Casey or Community Autism Socials at Yale. Um, so perhaps the most challenging part of this is that, you know, everyone's perspective is different, and I want to say that right in the beginning because, what you're hearing in this talk is really my perspective, the way that I sort of see it from the lens of, my life experience, and I know that other folks will have sort of different perspectives on this, some probably similar, some probably very different. And I'm very interested in hearing the perspectives of other people towards the end, or even after we're done with this webinar. So let me jump right in here and start with some simple definitions. So we all know what community is. It's one of those things where you hear the word, it's so common that we automatically think that we know exactly what it is. But in fact, this word is pretty complex. Um, the root of it is very intuitive, common unity, and it really is, at the most basic form, a segment of the population, that's sort of united around a similar thread. And these threads can be just about anything. So the diversity of communities is tremendous. And people can be part of different communities at the same time, separated by time. And these are very sort of dynamic systems. So they're constantly changing. They're constantly evolving. And sort of see this from the example in these slides. I would say that it's kind of self-evident that human beings need communities to survive. From our earliest ancestors who are sort of sharing the innovations of those days, like fire and maybe the invention of the wheel, and collaborating or working in teams to accomplish a common goal, such as sharing a nice feast. Now, it's such an important thing that there are actually a separate discipline called community studies, which really is sort of a combination of sociology and anthropologies. So we can go in a lot of different directions on this topic, but we're going to try to keep it as simple as possible for the sake of time. Now, we've come a long way, and really change, I think this slide sort of illustrates how really change is the rule and not the exception. So right now, our communities this day and age can be based on so many things, based on things as lighthearted as, say, yoga class, or something as maybe intense as healthcare, or social issues like LGBT rights, community service. Even in the news in most recent months, there's a millionaires club that's going into outer space, so, this is a very, very dynamic thing. And it continues to change. So notice in those previous pictures, all those communities were really groupings of people together, in a common space. But, with the rapid growth in technology, and also through a lot of current events, like the pandemic, communities continue to evolve. And in this case, you're seeing communities that are sort of shaped by, say, the coronavirus, where you're not allowed to be physically in the same space, but you can be in the same space virtually. So these virtual communities have become quite popular, since the pandemic. And they take the form of social media pages, or people meeting on Zoom on a regular basis. So lots of networking, without even having to be in the same physical space. So you can see that this community just really continues to evolve. Um, Now, I feel like most people, you're very familiar with the concept of community. You probably don't even think about it because your whole life, you've been part of a community, and you probably have had a lot in common with the folks around you, which really made it easy to join additional communities. So that's probably more of a experience for people who are, we'll say, neurotypical. Uh, but what if somebody is atypical? And that is what we're here to talk about mainly today. And we're going to start. We're going to turn the clock back, to when somebody is just a little wee lad, and talk about life experiences, and how they may shape communities. So this is I like to call this an experiential thread. You sort of see what it means. I mean, on one side, x-axis, you have just really vague sort of stress levels. Y-axis is good times, okay to distress. And on the X, you'll have age and years. And you'll see, it's for neurotypical, sort of a mainstream type of life experience. You have these events that are common in our lives. So things like birth of a sibling, school, teachers, exams, college, um, all of these things, and keep in mind that this is really just, this is more of a tool to help illustrate a point. It's not really hard data. But this is an example of maybe one person, how one person, would sort of experience their life based on what happened in their life, and their distress levels. So, it's pretty up and down, right? But I think, the main illustration here is that, overall, people are, feeling pretty good, you know. Uh, and if you have, if this is sort of a common thread, so no two experiences are ever going to be exactly the same. But if your experience is roughly the same with most of the people in this world, then you'll have a lot of sort of threads to be in common with others, and you'll be able to maybe connect with others. So in this typical situation, there's maybe a lot of communities you'd be part of, like sort of a new parent group if you're a parent. Maybe you have interest groups around like hobbies, sports, work groups, things that people around you, can really have in common with you, and that's how you can connect and you can remain connected with people. And that's sort of an example of a typical experience. Now, say that in a situation of neurodivergence, where you're, say, not neurotypical, but rather atypical. In this case, maybe you have a diagnosis of autism. The lifeline, or this common thread, is probably going to be less common. This is just one example. Say that you're living as a neurodivergent person. The experiences probably aren't going to be the same. They're probably going to be more challenging, because maybe the way that you're thinking, you're perceiving, is significantly different. So people may misunderstand you. They may react to you in a way that is, stressful. So different things happen to you, and overall, you're not really feeling okay. A lot of times you're spending significant periods of time in distress. And I think this chronic exposure to stress, can put someone at risk for other comorbidities like anxiety and depression. Um, and since the experience is not like most people around you, then it becomes more challenging, to connect with people. Not so much because autism is itself a considered a social disability, but your life experiences are, there's less in common there, so the relatedness also changes. So because of that, there's not really a lot of people who you can relate to, so you begin to feel sort of alone, and isolated. But it's actually still a lot of potential, so possibilities are still infinite, even though you are maybe not having the mainstream experience. Um, I think the issue here is like winning the lottery. If you want to compare it to that, it's you buy a ticket. It's theoretically possible that you win, but there's only one winning ticket, and say sort of millions that are sold. So the possibility or probability that there's a match becomes pretty low. Uh, and I think that that's something that uh, I'll talk about a little bit later, and how we're kind of work we're doing to try to overcome that. But in theory, this is still possible, with the right tools. And, what the adult autism community or autistic community, I think that you can see it in several different ways. One way I'm going to break it down is, who is primarily sort of driving the efforts. So, uh, there's family driven. So this is probably, I would say, mainly like parents who are sort of the driving force of creating the community or maintaining the community. Then you have communities that are, provider driven. So this could be professionals of some kind, doctors, therapists, social workers, um, other professionals. And then there's self-driven communities. So this is consists of autistic adults mainly. And it's important to make this distinction between autism versus autistic communities. This is something that uh, some of us here may not really make a clear distinction between these two, but autistic adults, are very aware of the differences between these. So, sort of a very simplified way, autistic communities are really consists of autistic people. Everything else, is considered part of the greater autism community. And you can see in this Venn diagram here, that these communities are not separate. They are very much enmeshed, and there's overlap. So you have folks who are right here in the middle in the gray area. You have a community that consists of sort of all folks who are in that um, in the autism from the autism and autistic community. But the autistic community, really is what you're seeing here in the green. That's part of um, people who have a diagnosis, of autism. All right, so let me just go through some basics about an autism community. So simplify, just about everyone who has something to do with autism, who's not autistic. This is one definition. I have to say that, like any uh, area of inquiry that is, relatively young, these terms are a bit fluid, so, some folks will sort of say, well, it's everybody, including autistic people. Some folks say, well, it's people really who don't have a diagnosis. To be consistent, this is how I'm going to define it for this particular talk, is people who have a stake in autism, meaning that usually people who are like professionals or family members, allies, professional organizations, don't necessarily have autism. It's a very diverse group of people, so it's really hard to sort of quantify, the amount of diversity here. There's different individuals who can be part of these communities. and their purpose is also very different, and they can be categorized based on maybe the primary intent. So you have communities that are sort of vocational driven, those who are more driven by support needs, or um, recreation. Really, the underlying or the overall goal, is to do something positive, really to improve quality of life for individuals with the diagnosis of autism. Now, these are probably the most well-known communities because they've been around the longest. So uh, pretty commonly in the form of these intentional communities. So probably in the states where you're at, I mean, I know that there's several in the state of Connecticut, organizations who help serve autistic adults, who focus on, life skills, employment. These are large agencies that have had their history in, parents, like say in the 70s and 80s, have had a child with autism, but was not able to find the supports they needed. So then they went ahead and they sort of built their own supports and continue to build on that in over time, forming a very intentional community to serve people who are neurodiverse. So there's many different examples. Some are new, some are old, some are big, some are small. Of course, they evolve over time. One example is the Daniel Jordan Fiddle Foundation for Adult Autism, and I'm bringing this one up because this foundation is probably the oldest foundation, nonprofit, really dedicated to adults with autism. So back in like 2002. So they're very much active in sort of supporting programs and funding programs that help adults living with autism or autistic adults, and their families. There's many, many other examples, but this one is definitely has always been adult focused and continues to be. All right, then on the other side, we have the autistic communities. Very simply, these are people with a diagnosis of autism. Now, the structure of these communities, I believe, are also very diverse. They can be based on interests or advocacy. I would say over the past like 10 to 15 years, these communities, the autistic community, has really grown tremendously. So the autistic community, by definition, includes autistic adults, and I think that this is a very interesting question. Why has there been so much activity, say, in the past 15 years? And I think that going through some of the history is important to sort of understand why we're seeing what we're seeing here. So sort of go back sort of the early 2000s or even before, when the awareness and diagnosis of autism was relatively modest compared to current times. So you're seeing in this first graph over here, over time, the diagnosis, this is where we're talking about the prevalence of autism becoming more and more frequent, so 1 in 54. So you can see from 2004 to about now, it's increased pretty substantially. So you have more adults who are, or more children who are being identified, who then of course become adults. Then you have this phenomenon of the cliff in the tsunami. And this has been written about in many different media outlets. But the idea here is that the tsunami, so to speak, is really these adults who have been diagnosed as children becoming 21, and then from that age, before that age, they were getting school services, and then after that age, those services drop off. So you've got this large number of adults who are sort of aging out of services. So you don't have a whole lot of options, afterwards. And I think this is an issue that we all sort of know about, but has had many different kinds of consequences. So you've had that. So you have a lot of adults, who who are not getting services. Then you have, there was like 10, 12 years ago, there was a sort of an ad campaign that was uh, sort of using negative stereotypes of autism and mental health, in an attempt to raise autism awareness. So, uh, one of the advocacy groups of autistic adults came together, and they sort of petitioned, to have these ads removed, and successfully did so. So that was a really an early example of how autistic adult communities really came together, to advocate for themselves, and sort of make some action in society. And probably since the turn of the century, internet use has really skyrocketed. So you have this rapidly growing online alternative way of sort of interacting with other people online, via social media. So I do think that all of these things sort of come together, and may contribute to the rise of the many autistic adult communities out there. Now, two potential subgroupings of communities, you have folks who they get together based on interests. Um, this is a pretty diverse bunch, so it's not entirely autistic adults, but a lot of neurodiverse individuals. So folks who enjoy role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, or like video games, or computers, cars. These can be led by autistic adults, supported by other neurotypes. Um, these have been, I think these groups have been around for quite some time, more in local communities. Um, but I think the group that has had most traction, and certainly a voice, is the advocacy-based communities. So these are folks, autistic adults, who have different ideology. There's certainly a leaning towards non-traditional and counterculture, with emphasis on sort of autistic pride and identity. Um, Typically, these are folks who are more independent communicators. They have less support needs. That's sort of an overall reading. I mean, certainly it's a very, very diverse group of people. They are very, very passionate, and their knowledge, or their knowledge base, is based on the fact that they were diagnosed with autism, and they grew up, being autistic, and what would the knowledge you have from that is it's hard to question. So this group has a very much an identity first orientation. So there was a time when sort of medicine and sort of the healthcare profession would not use the word autistic person, but that has really changed with autistic adult communities, many of whom prefer the identity first mentality. All right, so probably the prime example of this is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. This has been around for like over 15 years, and I believe this was the group who successfully petitioned to have those ads removed that were using negative stereotypes of autism. So this is a group that's continued to grow, and is very much active today. All right, so as you might expect, there's a lot of great things that have come out of this. One of this is now what we regularly recognize as Autistic Pride Day is June 18th. I believe it's something that was started about 15 years ago, and every year I believe it is becoming bigger and bigger. Now, this is part of the movement with the autistic communities of moving past the notion of just awareness. So moving past awareness and then going more into acceptance, and then of course pride. And this pride has really been very sort of instrumental in sort of changing the conversation of what diversity looks like. in the past, we have, everyone knows what physical diversities are, what they might look like, but really shining the light on the kinds of diversity, that you don't really see sort of superficially, so neurodiversity. And not just with respect to sort of autism, but also through other kinds of differences, like sort of things that may have been considered psychiatric, may not be so psychiatric. They're just different ways of being, and sort of the acceptance that these are no, there's really not a right way that one should be. One should sort of be who they are, who they were born to be. And really the disability, is not so much biological, but it's sort of based in, society. So, the idea that the handicap or the disability comes from sort of a lack of sort of awareness, lack of acceptance, and lack of sort of accommodation, appropriate accommodation. So, this has led to a lot of a lot of knowledge, a lot of awareness in the public, but it's also led to some sort of complications, in how adults or autistic adults, reflect back on their childhood, and they have opinions about how they were treated, and how they see parents of children with autism, treating their children. So this is actually quite a complex topic. It could actually even be a whole presentation by itself. But you have sort of pushing against sort of the norms of how parents might raise their children with autism. So different kinds of therapies, can be called into question, or criticized, or sort of sharing the perceptions of autism as something negative, in some parent groups, with behaviors that may be deemed as sort of deviant or challenging, as contributing to sort of these negative stereotypes, and often a belief or an idea that the reaction that society has to autism is also part of the problem. So there is sort of this ongoing conversation between parents of kids with autism and autistic adults. But there is also this differences of opinion, with the professional crowd as well. So the people who are providing support and services to children with autism, you know are those services, and are those supports, how helpful are they? And we often see sort of different arguments for things that were uh, accepted as commonplace or sort of standard of care. All right, so how do you then address this problem? um, I always feel that sometimes these these debates get a little heated. People can get sort of upset quite easily, um, and I think that really it is sort of a lack of understanding, that could be helped with uh, sort of listening and really understanding one side. Uh, Make sure you understand them completely, before you're going to then ask them to understand your perspective. And how we're doing that is through this, this Project Casey program, which we've been running for April 2014. This has been an online community, an in-person community that has evolved over time. Uh, Really was a parent group initially, and then over the years became sort of an exclusive adult autism group. So it is very much started as um, it's always been like a hybrid community, right? So we sort of leverage online and local sort sort of resources to sort of bring community together. Really, the bottom line is to improve quality of life. It's very much a less of a top-down type of approach and more of a collaborative and organic approach. In-person meetings have really been the mainstay of that, but then COVID hit, so then we've really moved to online, and we found ways to connect and have conversations with people more so than we ever could have in person. So, these are some of the examples of the in-person meetings. So there really is quite a large diversity of them. You're seeing people in like different settings, from hiking to video games to arts. Really, the whole idea here is that it's not really, some people might say, oh, is this some kind of a social skills program? It really isn't. It really is a sort of a social recreation type wellness, paradigm, where what you're doing is you're creating experiences that people would, want to be part of. And, you're creating a safe place for that to happen, and people spontaneously and voluntarily come, and they sort of put their best foot forward and end up having a pretty good time. So it does take quite a bit of planning and coordination, but it is something that has been really well received over the years. All right, so that was in person, and then with the pandemic, we were really stuck with a problem of how do we sort of continue our interactions, our conversations, and our work together despite having these orders of staying at home. So it was either we're in a fork in the road where we either had to sort of shut the thing down temporarily, or maybe try to have some meetings, but then there would be a risk associated with that. So we tried a third alternative, and that is sort of using technology. So pivoting to what we're calling distance socializing through technology like Zoom primarily. And really, we thought that what this could do is help protect folks' mental health during a pandemic, protect their physical health by keeping them away from folks who may be potentially infected, but also a sort of a channel to promote the partnership and collaboration. We find that certainly the latter really has had a tremendous impact on the collaboration that we have with autistic adults. Now, these little images here, they're basically every time we have an event, we have to have a picture associated with the event. So these are the sort of the very diverse number of events we have. Just go through some of these really quick, like for instance, the comic book group. We've had talks on self-care, self-advocacy, talks on fitness. A women's group. We've had COVID coping groups. Groups on, let's see, communicating with coworkers, a lunch group for people who just spontaneously want to talk to each other. Let's see, what else do we have here? Like a show and tell for kids, a lot of online games. So I think there's a Pictionary picture here, or special interest group behind this. So a lot of different things that you can do online via Zoom, provided that people are comfortable and they have access to technology and they know how to use it. All right, so this has really, the project has really reinforced the idea that this paradigm shift is something that we need to sort of continue. So this idea that being a university, hospital system, being a center of expertise, that when you're sort of going into new areas, that less about, it becomes less of a top-down type of a strategy, or an approach, So moving from sort of this hierarchical top-down to something more ground level, So, you're this image here, we're pretty much calling on all the community to come together and have conversation, more on a horizontal level, where different groups, that we all have value and we all can all contribute to uh, troubleshooting. And I think with the technology now that's available, we've been able to do this even more. All right, and it's not just all work online. We do have, this program is very much based on recreation. So one thing we do is probably our longest standing event is a Friday afternoon happy hour, where we all just sort of hop online and we talk about a lot of different things. We even have like these table topics, which generate some really interesting questions that are good material to share with people and help people bond. All right. So one thing before I close is, this use of technology. I think a lot of folks are concerned that, how is technology going to sort of impact uh, human interactions? And the way I see it is that, technology, you have to be very mindful, when you use technology. And, one quote I like is this: is technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. The idea here being that technology is basically a tool, so uh, in sort of mental health, we're very much used to talking about, toolbox, or different ways that we can, different skills that we learn so we are able to accomplish our goals. I believe technology is just another tool in the toolbox of sort of connecting with others. And that's something that we continue to use and develop for that purpose. Okay, I will take any questions.
Hi, Roger. It's Beverly again. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, fab. So we do have sort of a lot of questions coming in. So let me just jump in. What do you think the changes in the DSM from distinct diagnoses to an ASD one might have for the adult autism community?
Um, I think that the distinct diagnoses, I think at the end of the day, it is, one should be one unified community. I think the problem with the one of the problems I would say with the old diagnosis system is that it was creating some segregation, between people with autism. So folks with Asperger's, were thinking a certain way, or that maybe perpetuates even some stereotypes. That Asperger's is one way. If you're autistic disorder, you're another way. If you're PDD-NOS, then you're in this third category. So, I think that it was probably, create a more fractured environment. And I do think sort of the move to sort of spectrum is better for community unity.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, here's another question. What can or should the neurotypical community do more or less of to support the autistic adult community?
Yes, that's a great question because, it sounds like it could be simple, but it really is so difficult. um, yeah, I think the slide where I had put out that said first seek to understand, then to be understood. So the most important thing is making sure that I think people are really heard, and we're not really talking about, all right, you go first, while I think about formulating my response. This is like really truly, understanding, that person's perspective, as an individual who is very much different from, say, sort of neurotypical life experience, um, and not sort of jumping to conclusions, with stereotypes, or assuming that you sort of understand when you don't really understand. I think that's a huge problem, not just for this community, but for just all communities. Is sort of the ability to really sort of understand others, from their viewpoint. You know, uh, yeah, and there's a lot of nuances to that. and some things that we may just easily overlook, because these assumptions that we make about people are so ingrained. So really, trying your best to first truly understand the other, uh, before responding to them, uh, and um, I would say talk to as many folks as you can, because you know, it is really a diverse community of people. And the other part of it is not uh, all whom you speak to sort of represent a whole community, right? So
Mm,
just because
right.
somebody is sort of verbally uh, more independent in their communication, doesn't mean that they are sort of the voice for all of autism. So you have folks who may rely on devices to help them, or you have folks who are primarily or maybe minimally verbal, but they can't really speak for themselves, but doesn't mean that you know they do not exist in the community.
Mm,
So you
mm.
have to really make sure that you don't, that you're accounting for all of the diversity as well, and not just the folks who are talking to you face to
Mm.
face.
Speaking of nonverbal, we did get a question about what have you done any work with non-community based with nonverbal adults or nonverbal kiddos?
Yeah, we've had more so when prior to the pandemic, we did have some
Mm,
sensory groups that we run. Um, we have several minimally verbal adults who are helped by their parents, in the online community. And it's it really is challenging in the sense that people sort of enjoy say groups in a different way. We have one family who they're just their son is just very happy to sort of see the other folks on the screen because he recognizes them as his friends. He may not
oh,
quite
yeah.
what people are talking about, but he waves at them, people wave back, and he feels included, even though, it could be sort of an hour long meeting, and he may not understand what people are saying, but, it's still meaningful to him. Uh, so, I think that, using that information, so, it's easy to just sort of assume that, okay, well, if people, cannot speak, then, how can they make use of an online group? Yeah,
Mm,
and that may
mm.
seem, okay, well, yeah, I guess that might make sense, but, it makes sense provided that, people sort of enjoy social interaction in just one way. People can enjoy social interaction in different ways, and being open to that and using that knowledge to create opportunities, for, people that would benefit from that.
Okay. Are there any suggestions for dealing with very low self-esteem resulting from not fitting in? This person is 60. So older adults.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is, when we're talking about, the common threads uh, early in the talk, you have people who, say that you're in the category where autism was, you were not identified, and you went through life, uh, somewhat frustrated and maybe even confused about, why things are happening in a certain way. Uh, and sort of the consequence of that is, one consequence, people feeling very, very bad about themselves. And I think that's where like a group really comes in, can really be helpful, because I think part of that experience is a lot of sort of isolation and possibly, shame, and thinking that, there's something, really fundamentally wrong with, you as a person, when in fact, there's nothing wrong at all. You are different, and being different is different than being wrong. But the
Mm,
idea here is that uh, it's hard to sort of, you can say that to somebody, but are they really going to believe you? How are they going to take it to heart? You know, And it really helps a lot if there's other people you connect with who have had a similar experience, uh, and sort of have, and you're able to share those experiences, and then process those experiences and create sort of revised ways of thinking, that uh, can help your self-esteem. It sort of helps you think differently about yourself, based on new information that other people bring in who have shared, say, a similar situation. you know so that is the kind of learning that can be pretty powerful through groups. Uh, the, the main challenge is really sort of finding people who are an appropriate fit. A lot of things
Mm.
are possible theoretically, but when it comes down to it, if things are uncommon, then they're just simply harder to find. And part of uh, the approach, or the online approach, is to being able to connect people who probably would have never met otherwise, but are sort of maybe in very different geographical locations, but have a lot of similarities in their upbringing and life experience.
Okay. Can you recommend any books that we could read about this to help the family to understand?
Um, I mean, what I can do, I think probably would be helpful, is really to, I can sort of gather a list of
Yeah,
reading.
that'd be great.
'Cause I don't think that, I mean, books are,
Old
I think that,
school.
yeah, not so much old school, but I think that this stuff is so, it's kind of like, I remember this back in the days of, like, Microsoft Word. You could sort of
Yeah.
go out and buy a book on Microsoft Word, you know, and then it would be good for a few years. You know, I think the issue with this kind of stuff is it changes so quickly. So a lot of, if you write a book on it, it would be very easy for it to be sort of dated. you know so the best way to learn happens to be connecting with communities and really
Mhm.
listening to, following to, sort of the issues and topics that are being discussed. um, but I think that there's probably some books, I'm sure there are books out there that may look at some of the more fundamental issues, things that,
Okay.
or the principles that may not change so much over time.
Okay, just one or two more. We have a lot of questions here, so I think we can only get through a couple more of them. So one is, now that Casey is moved online, are you planning on keeping it there indefinitely, even beyond the pandemic? And since it's expanded nationwide, what are your plans to accommodate that growth in participation?
That's a great question. We think about that every day.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so we've certainly, as I've said in one of the previous slides, technology is a tool. So we don't really make the distinction, online communities, in person. It's all, the Casey community is, it's not really, that's not how it's defined. It's really defined by the people in it, not so much exactly where they are or how we're communicating with them. Uh, and we've sort of reached a lot of people through Zoom. Actually, a lot of our membership,
Hmm.
we really have folks from, like, say, I don't know, across the country, even like around the world, who will sort of come and join the groups and join the discussions. So, the online part I see is, will always be part of the program. And that's also part of being, uh, open-minded.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then that groups are not defined by who can get together in a room. This is sort of the traditional view, right?
Mhm.
Now, the evolved view is that, that geographics don't really matter.
Mm.
What really matters is the sort of the connectedness between people. And if that's what it takes to connect more people, then that's what we're going to do.
Okay, so another question is, what's your model to assess whether Casey is meeting the needs of the participants?
Yeah, so we periodically will send out surveys.
Hmm.
uh, and a lot of, actually, a lot of the meetings we have, this is a common issue as to, we track very much participation, we track how many people join, these sort of things. And we're constantly asking for feedback, on what is working, what is not working, you know. Uh, and it really is sort of a work in progress, and we're learning also that, you know, a lot of people may not feel comfortable giving feedback, and what you see that is, you see sort of reductions and sort of attendance. So we certainly use sort of attendance, as a measure, but people who are willing to participate in those kinds of conversations, we really try to ask them about it, like what's working for them and what's not, and really making changes, real time, so that we can adjust to um, the population. Yeah, I mean, it is one thing that's really taught us is that, you cannot, there is really no simple turnkey solution that's going to work for everyone. And I think this is a bit of a myth, is that, you think that it should look a certain way, and if not everyone's participating, it's because, you just haven't figured out, the magic formula, you know. Well, there is no magic formula. There's, people have different preferences in how they want to communicate, when they want to communicate, how they want to communicate, you know, and those differences, uh, they're differences, right? So not everyone's going to sort of hop on the same means of communication, and then you're going to be done with it. I think you have, part of the group is really meeting people where they are, and offering things to people based on, their comfort levels or their preferences, So it really is sort of figuring out too, what is it that, people prefer and want, and being able to sort of offer in a way that's sustainable, So one way we've tried to address the sustainability issue is, we're trying to have members sort of run their own groups. So
Mm, mm.
this mainly for people who have been in the group for a while. We know them pretty well. They're excited to do certain things. And that's not in the talk that I gave, but a lot of those groups are actually member run. Uh, so that's one way. If you have uh, to address sort of the communication preference, and possibly sort of the amount of interests, so you can diversify and address different interests, can address different communication styles, right? But since the groups don't require, not all of them will require sort of this one-to-one presence, by myself or the folks who sort of work at the university. uh, they can, sort of run independently,
Mm,
with some
mm,
guidance. So,
mm.
that's sort of the one of the models that we're trying to build out.
I'm going to try to squeak in two more questions. I know we're really hard on our hour. I'm pushing your patience. One question, we've got several of these are related around different locations in the US. So one question, is there anybody doing anything related to this research in Cincinnati? And somebody else is interested in knowing and what's going on in the eastern part of North Carolina, if there's any social recreational programs. Do you have any sense of what's going on in other places in the US?
Uh, yeah, I'm not familiar with those areas.
Okay.
Um, I know on the local area, I mean, on the local scenes, people are doing things. I mean, I would say like the smaller the city, maybe it's going to be less likely. Um, but I know that parent groups, for instance, I mean, you should also look at sort of local nonprofits, because even though um, they may be smaller, they also have a lot of offerings. Like for instance, we have I know of a place that also runs different groups, kind of similar to what we do, but it's more, they're different, so in some ways you can sort of build different, you can build your day based on the different groups that are running at different
Mm,
times.
mm,
uh,
okay.
you know the KC platform is sort of housed in Meetup, so one thing you might check out is the Meetup site. And you can actually look for, You can search by interest and by geographical area. So you can search, say, autism, in this zip code, and you can
Oh,
scan the search as well, and then you see what pops up. So Meetup is a site that allows individuals. It's kind of like a grassroots type of a tool where individuals locally, can create interest groups or gatherings to bring together others who have sort of similar interests. So I think I would probably start there first, and that would probably give you some uh, some good results. And a lot of folks are also doing virtual stuff. So, the just because some place is based out in the next state over doesn't mean that they're going to be keeping people out who want to participate from across the country. I mean, my understanding, I don't know any meetup group that does that. Usually these, it wouldn't make sense also from people who value inclusivity. So, I would reach out to, if you find a group, I would reach out to the organizers of the group and ask them the questions if they can, to see if the group is a good fit for you or son or daughter.
okay. We're not going to get to everything. The questions are flooding in. Dr. Joe, thank you so much for doing this. That's unfortunately all the time we have for today. So amazing presentation, and thank you to everybody who's joined us today.